So last time we left off with day 2. So we'll pick up at day 2, which is Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 is where we start out. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so." This is probably one of the most puzzling of all the days, because most people are like, what is a firmament? It's not really something we talk about anymore. Even here, St. Basil in his third homily provides no exact definition of a firmament. He said the word usually means something very strong and unyielding and solid. However, in this context, he said it would have to mean something that's invisible and cannot be grasped by any one of our senses. It's meant to show us that there was a division of water in the sky and water down below, but it doesn't explain what that means at all. Alfric, the author of the Anglo-Saxon Hexameron, writes that the Lord formed the firmament which men call Rhodor in their day. It ever spins around the earth like a wheel, going round 24 times a day. Rhodor was used mostly in poetry to refer to the heavens, sky, or upper region. But again, this still doesn't make things clear. The Venerable Bede quotes an ancient source, somebody named Clement, although we're not sure which Clement it was. In that source, this is God making the angelic heavens and the physical world, so making that division there. The second day gives detail to the opening verse, God made the heavens and the earth. And so it's looked at as the firmament is that division between heaven and earth, the angelic realm and the earthly realm. I decided to check another source called the Legends of the Jews, if any of you are familiar with that. It's a bunch of, most of you probably aren't, it's a bunch of ancient Jewish mythology, basically. And so I looked at that source, and that also was not particularly helpful. They didn't say anything about what the firmament is, although they gave the opinion that it was something that hell was made on that day, and that's what the lower end of everything was. So the Jews saw this day literally and symbolically as the most divisive day of all. Some things move upward to the heavens, other things are pushed against their will to the lowest depths. Ephrem insists that when God looks upon all creation in the sixth day, he calls it very good, and so that can't include hell, because God would not create hell and call it very good. That is the Christian opinion on that. Ancient people thought, and this is kind of an interesting thing, ancient people thought that all of the rain that was to ever fall on the earth for all time is like somewhere up in the sky, and it's up above the upper firmament. So St. Basil even references this in his day. All the church fathers pretty much, because that was just the science of the time, they thought that there was a lot of water stored up there for all the rains that would happen, and so that this division made sense for them. They didn't know what a firmament was still, but the idea that there was a division between the upper waters and the lower waters made sense. So it doesn't quite make as much sense for us today. St. Basil says that we don't know what it was really, and we shouldn't allow our imagination to wander too far afield, which is probably good advice. God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. St. Basil tells us not to think of this firmament as literally being heaven, unlike the ancient source Clement. The way he describes it, the best word that we could use in English would just be sky, when St. Basil gives a very brief description of it. So the kingdom of heaven is not in a firmament up above us, just in case you were wondering. Much to the chagrin of the people who built the Tower of Babel, or were trying to, since they were attempting to reach that firmament. But we'll get into that story later. Several modern translations use the word sky instead of heaven, and that's probably fitting for what it is. So, any questions on day 2
So when Origen gives the opinion about the lower depths and all the devils and everything down there,
Mm-hmm.
he's in agreement with some of the Jewish mythology, which you're indicating.
Yeah, I suppose. I'd have to double check what Origen said, but I'm actually going to have a class, maybe the one after this one or the one after that, that's just on what Origen and some of the allegorical texts say about this, because it's so radically different from all of the other church fathers that I don't want to mix it in.
But when Basil talks about the idea of the separation between the waters being the angelic and the demonic, he calls it ingenious and really interesting, but really not true. And I think he's indicating some of the heretics, but I guess he must be indicating the Jews too.
He's probably referencing Origen more than anybody, because St. Basil and his brother Gregory of Nyssa and their best friend Gregory the theologian of Nazianzen were big fans of Origen, but they also were very aware that he was wrong in some areas. And his style of allegorical commentary, which we'll get into more, was so popular that you see in Basil's 9th homily in there that the people are dismayed that he's not giving some lofty allegorical interpretation of everything. Mm-hmm. And he kind of argues with them that he's not going to do that because half the reason he thinks people are doing it, because people are still doing it to his day the way he's talking about it. Half the reason, he says, is they want to use highfalutin language basically to impress people, and it's no longer about the truth, and it's just to like see how imaginative you can be and what sort of crazy stuff you can put out there to entertain the mob, basically. And he said he's not going to do that. So we'll get into that more later. There is, of course, Origen, and there's a saint of the Orthodox Church, Anastasius of Sinai, who has an allegorical interpretation of Genesis that's significantly longer, or just the Hexaemeron, that's significantly longer than Origen's. Origen's is like maybe 20 pages on the Hexameron, and this guy wrote 300. Yeah, so it's a whole lot to plow through right now. What's that?
He's a secret Calvinist.
No, but he was definitely not a secret Origenist either. He calls Origen out on his errors when he's doing it. But we'll get more into that later. But any other points on the second day? Okay, we'll go into day 3. God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So we see division now a few times. God divides light from darkness on day 1, the waters above from the waters below on day 2, and now the land from the waters here in day 3. So we have a division happening every single day. Each division is a form of order. It's making the earth habitable. Nowadays, we usually see division, and we're told division is bad, like division's evil. There should never be any kind of division. However, there are times that unity is not good. For example, there's the story which I referenced earlier of the Tower of Babel, when humanity made a unified attempt to overcome the heavens. Division can be good, especially when it's done to create order out of chaos. That is the theme in nearly every ancient cosmogony, including one of the ones we went through last week, the Enuma Elish. There is the Tiamat, goddess of the waters, who is the representation of chaos. And she was slayed and divided in half. And from those two halves, creation was made. And so chaos had to be divided in order for order to come out of it. Another example that we can see every day is something we call death. Death is a lack of division at the biological level. It's everything outside of the body entering it when it should not be entering it. It's because the body's dead and no longer has the capacity to divide the outside from the inside. Another example would be an artist who keeps her paints divided, or else a mixture of all the colors together is going to create a very ugly mess. It would be, I don't know, do we have any artists in here?
Unless you count color pencils.
Well,
They're always
if you
demonic.
mixed all of your paints together, what sort of color would you get?
You get brown.
Yeah, it'd just be kind of a drab sort of thing. Yeah, it would not be anything that you could create a lot of beauty out of. Not as much as having more access to colors. So some mixture with the outside, however, is necessary to survive, such as when we take food in. But that's done with discernment. We divide food even up to the moment that we consume it. Because if we put a spoon in our mouth, we don't eat the spoon. We divide the food from the spoon. And so there's division that's constantly happening even when we are taking things in and bringing them into communion with ourselves. Likewise, the church brings in catechumens and new believers to grow, yet it has always divided heretics from itself to preserve order and life. Both division and inclusion have to be done with discernment. There can be too much order, which can look like an obsessive fixation on cleanliness or planning in the home life. And at the government level, it's authoritarian control or surveillance. There can also be too much chaos when nothing is cleaned or planned, or in society when disorder rules. And of course, we've seen some examples of both those things in just the last few years in our country. So naming and order is the next section I want to go to, because God names the firmament heavens, he named the dry land earth, he named the waters seas. St. John Chrysostom says, "The loving Lord does not give names to the elements until he has assigned them to their own place through his own arrangement." We also saw that the firmament, I already mentioned that the firmament was called heaven. Division brings order to chaos. This order makes it possible to name things. To give a name is to assign meaning and purpose to something. A blank canvas with a tray of paint next to it has potentiality, but no actuality. However, once the artist paints something, they can name the image. Likewise, we are given a name at our baptism or chrismation in the Orthodox Church when we come into the church. Not just any name, but a saint's name. And we take on the name of someone who is holy. This is our calling from God, the calling to leave the darkness and move into the light, receiving a name that reveals holiness in both potentiality and actuality. Potentiality, because we have a long way to go in the Christian struggle to overcome our sinful passions. But actuality, because God's grace is actively working in each of us, bringing us to salvation with each day that we struggle. And this is alluded to a little bit in Revelation chapter 2. "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give him some of the hidden manna to eat. And I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it." So to be named is to have holiness, an interior order that aligns with the kingdom of heaven, divided from the darkness of sin and death. It is to be loved and know love. Additionally, manna is the heavenly bread, which is Eucharistic. When offering the Eucharist to someone, the priest uses their new name in Christ. So whatever your baptism name is, when you come into the church, that's what I would use when I give you the Eucharist. All these things tie together, entry into the church, dividing ourselves from the world, receiving a saint's name, receiving the heavenly manna in the Eucharist, and becoming truly holy ourselves. So at the end of this day, it mentioned that God saw that it was good. And I want to talk about that word a little bit in the Greek. The word is kalos. It is translated as either good or beautiful. So when it says that God saw that it was good, the Greek word in the Septuagint, remember most of the church fathers read the Septuagint. They weren't reading Bibles like we have today. They were reading a version of Genesis that was translated a few hundred years before Christ in Egypt, in the Alexandria area. And this was called the Septuagint. And that's just what everybody used up until Martin Luther, basically. They were either using the Latin Vulgate in the West, or they were using the Septuagint in the East to study the Scripture. Hardly anybody actually knew Hebrew or was looking at a direct translation from the Hebrew. Although I believe the Vulgate was translated from the Hebrew. Jerome knew Hebrew pretty well because he studied with some Jews. But if you remember, there's an Orthodox text called the Philokalia, which means the love of the beautiful. The double meaning of this word, both good and beautiful, is utilized by St. Basil in several times of the Hexameron. If you read and pay attention to what he's saying, you realize that he's playing on that double usage of the word quite often. And he says that he does it because God is the supreme artist and praises each one of his works. And soon, when his work is complete, he will give well-deserved praise to the whole together. However, Basil emphasizes that this praise isn't because the creation is lovely to behold with the eye. It's not like it's just pretty and he says, oh, okay, this is good, this is beautiful, this is kalos. It's beautiful because it is good. And it is good because it is in complete accordance with the way that God made it to be. Everything existing as it should. That's what makes it kalos. That's what makes it both good and beautiful. God contemplates the beauty of his works in his ineffable wisdom. That's what Basil writes. The ocean created on this day is great and vast and praises God in its own way. And St. Basil relates that to the church and says, how much more beautiful is the assembly of a church like this, where the voices of men, children, and women arise in the prayers to God, mingling and resounding like the waves that beat upon the shore. And this comparison of the church to the Great Sea, we will see later if we get into, someday I would like to do a Revelation study, and that is used in Revelation when you see the mention of the Great Sea that's smooth and everything. It is the church. That's how the church fathers interpret that. But we'll get into that some other time. So moving on, Genesis 1:11 through 13, God said, let the earth bring forth grass, herb yielding seed, fruit, tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after its kind, and trees yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the third day. Here again, we see the establishment of good order in the Genesis narrative. God, who had just created the dry land, now orders earth to adorn itself with plant life, which it did with trees and flowers and everything else. Following the pattern of order, each kind of plant in turn reproduces its own kind. Thank God. Imagine a world where you would sow seed and you didn't know what was going to pop up. It would be really hard for us to survive that way because we kind of require seed to be sown. But everything is done orderly. Things reproduce after their kind. St. Basil points out that plants were created before the sun because God knew that mankind would eventually worship the sun and heavenly luminaries as the author of life and the creators of life in this world. And I mean, really, if you think about it from the ancient perspective, their reasoning does kind of make some sense. Warmth and life come from the sun. Additionally, plants respond to the sun and provide us food. And they were also very big into astrology and trying to figure out patterns in the sky and what that meant for your life and getting caught up in kind of a fatalistic outlook. St. Basil tells us that God created the plants first and the sun the next day so that those who worship the sun as the source of life may renounce their error, seeing that the sun has a creator itself and the plants could survive with the light that comes from God. Today, of course, we're not tempted to worship the sun. I don't know, has anyone here ever worshipped the sun? No, I don't think so. Yeah. Anyone known anybody who's worshipped the sun? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I got a friend that's a pretty big pagan.
Okay,
So,
yeah. How does that work? Okay, we won't go there.
It's very unusual.
Yeah, because I mean, most pagan practices were stamped out by Christianity so long ago that they're like just literally making stuff up.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's made up.
Yeah. Okay. So we don't worship the sun. However, we are pretty much tempted to worship the technology and scientific knowledge that we have. And that's because rationality has this really funny effect or way of causing us to want to worship our own creation, whether it be a technological thing or even at the government level. We tend to want to venerate and worship and find precious that which we create with our rational minds. And we think that because we know how something works, the why is arbitrary. We know, for example, how sugar and bacteria mixed with grape juice turn into wine. At least some scientist out there does. And we think that settles the issue for us, but we don't know why those processes occur in nature. We don't know why God made that happen. Of course, not just with wine, but just about every society has had their alcoholic drink with whatever they happen to have on hand. As long as it's got sugar in it, it will ferment. To aid in growing crops, we can forecast weather, create synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and we think we're in control. But then there's years like this one that happened, 2023, where out in Kansas, they are having a major crop failure, major wheat failure. They're expecting to have a harvest, let's see here, what was the years, that is similar to 1963 or 1957, depending on exactly how many bushels come in. The U.S. population was half of what it was back then, or what it is now. And so major crop failure simply because it didn't rain enough out there in Kansas. And we think we're in control. We think technology has made us completely independent of God and the need to rely on nature. And yet we still have little famines that occur even in this country. God probably does that to humble us. We need that water stored up above the firmament, I guess. And then, of course, if you are reading through the Hexameron, you have noticed that St. Basil loves moral interpretations, and he always is pulling out some moral interpretations. So, because I am basing this outline on his work, I thought I would address a few of those. He gives us the beautiful flowers of the field that are here one day and dried up the next, to show us how transient this life is and to not rely on our riches, on our wealth, on our power and esteem if we happen to have those things. Because like the flower that dies and withers, so each one of us will do. And then, of course, there's the thorns and other undesirable plants. He reminds us that God does nothing without a purpose. And if there's a plant that seems no good to us, and it's probably because we simply haven't discovered a good use for it. And besides that, not everything has been created with the wants of our bellies in mind. And as science has progressed, we have certainly found lots and lots of uses for many things in creation. And so his words still stand true to this day. Likewise, the rose teaches us a lesson. Before the fall, he says roses had no thorns, but they grew them afterward to remind us that pain always seems to follow pleasure in this life. And it also reminds us that our sin condemned the beauty of the earth to produce thorns. And there's the wheat and the tares. I'm sure you all remember that from our Lord's lesson about the sowing of the wheat. And as it's growing, tares grow up along with it. And those, if you know anything about those tares, they look a lot like wheat. So as it's starting to grow, you can't really tell the two apart. But then when it matures, especially, how many of you have seen a wheat field and like walk through it and been able to pull kernels off and everything? They're nice golden color. They're quite pretty. But the tares, also called darnel, has a black head, and it's poisonous and will cause severe vomiting, diarrhea, and even death. So it's really bad news. You don't want to consume that. So our Lord was giving that example from creation to teach us about the church, and that there would be those that would rise up in the church who teach heresy and take advantage of innocent people and try to push their heresies on others. But just as the angels cut the tares and threw them into the fire, our Lord warns us that such a thing awaits those who try to sow bad seed in the church. And then one other moral lesson, he has a bunch of them, but this last one I thought was good. He mentioned that agriculturists had certain practices to rectify unproductive or poorly producing trees. He says that this should be an encouragement to all of us. I don't know anything about this. Do any of you like the way that they can treat a tree to make the bad fruit on it good? Yeah, so he said people were doing that in his time. So anyway, I'm not an agriculturist, so I don't know anything about it. But he uses this as a way to say, if you feel like you are a bad tree producing bad fruit, don't give up, don't be dismayed. There is hope. We serve the chief agriculturist who can give us the medicine we need to turn the bad fruit into good fruit. There are no hopeless cases because God can heal everyone. So that's day 3. Any questions on that? Thoughts? Yes.
I just have a question. When he's talking talking about naming the dry land Earth. Not trying to pick on St. Basil,
Mhm.
St. Basil, but it's kind of interesting because he's talking about like dryness being the defining quality of the earth, and so
Mhm.
that's why the dry land, so that's why he calls it Earth or anything.
Mhm.
But it's just kind of interesting to me because like back in Homily 1, he was talking about how you can't properly say. You can't say God created evil because evil is just, a lack of good.
Mhm.
So, if God created the earth, it's just kind of interesting that, like, I don't know. I guess how can you say that dryness is like the defining quality of the earth when dryness is just like a lack of water?
Well, I think he's just saying that that's what makes it not the bottom of the sea or a lake bed or something like that. It's earth that you can live on. It's earth that you can plant. It's earth that the cattle can graze on. It has to be dry. It can't be a marsh. It can't be something murky. So that I think that's what he's saying is that's what makes it earth, is that it's above the level of water and it's not submerged.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, we'll move to day 4. God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the 4th day. So basically the creation of the heavenly luminaries. Regarding these celestial lights, we see a continuation in the theme of bringing order by separating one thing from another. That is separating blankness and nothingness and pulling light out of it. St. Basil sees the events of this day, lights dividing day and night, as God typologically separating the power and activity of fire. The sun provides both light and heat. The moon provides only light. A separation of the powers of fire to St. Basil is what is happening there. He then turns to the burning bush as an example. The bush burned yet was not consumed. And as I mentioned earlier, that is a type of the Theotokos, who received the fire of God's divinity inside of her at the conception, the Annunciation, and was not burned or destroyed by receiving the God who is a consuming fire. Likewise, Basil sees this as an image of the coming judgment. Our God is a consuming fire, and of course this is a very common theme in the Cappadocian Fathers, that God is a consuming fire, and in the end time, everybody will go to be before God. Heaven and hell, as St. Gregory of Nyssa would say, don't even exist from God's perspective. It's our reaction to meeting God. This consuming fire will either be illuminating, or it will be caustic and it will be burning us. It'll be a fire that purifies and illumines and comforts and warms us, or it'll be a fire that burns savagely, and it'll be a hellfire. So it's from God's perspective, heaven and hell are the same. From our perspective, they're radically different, and we might as well call them two different places, because of how different they are depending on the orientation of our heart and how we've prepared ourselves to meet the God of consuming fire. So that's kind of what Basil is getting at by talking about this separation of the powers of fire as a type and leading to God and the last judgment. In the same epistle, of course it's a different day, but St. Paul mentions the creation of light and says, "For it is the God who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." And as I mentioned earlier, St. Basil was trying to refute astrology in his homilies. This was very popular during his time, and it's still somewhat popular nowadays. There are certainly people who read their horoscopes and actually believe it. He discusses at length the ways that people would do that. I don't know how many of you all read Homily 6, but the ways that people would wait to hear that the baby was born, and then they would go out and check the night sky to see what was happening and where exactly the stars were, and try to come up with what the fate of this baby would be, especially if the person was going to be a ruler born in the king's house or something like that. They felt that whatever was happening in the sky pretty well sealed the fate of this baby. But of course we have free will, and that's part of being in the image of God. And St. Basil explains that just as darkness is the absence of light, so evil is the absence of good, as Christiana mentioned earlier. Evil has no nature in itself, rather it is a corruption of the good nature that God created with us with. Evil is taking our free will and using it to choose what is outside God. And this day would be, according to the ancient reckoning, the 12th of the calends of April, the fourth day of creation, and so it was believed that this would have happened on the spring equinox. The birth of the cosmos would be, and the birth of the sun would be at the point where their light is increasing and the days are starting to be longer than the nights. And then he says that basically this is the Easter never falls before the spring equinox. That's part of how we come up with the date of Easter. And Easter is, in some sense, kind of a anniversary of the creation of the sun and moon, because it falls right around that time, and we're celebrating life and light overcoming darkness and death and all that. So all these things tie in, and I think this came from the Anglo-Saxon Hexameron. So if any of you got a chance to read that. Saint Theophilus of Antioch, who lived in the 100s, wrote that the sun is a type of God and the moon of man. And as the sun far surpasses the moon in power and glory, so far does God surpass man. Also, the sun never changes. God remains steadfast in every way, whereas man is inclined to change for a multitude of reasons. So like the moon, we change, we ebb and flow in our strength. Just like you go from new moon to full moon, we have that period of growth and increasing in strength, and then we hit middle age and we are like the moon that's waning and lose our strength and everything. So the moon is an icon of man in that sense, and the sun an icon of God, who is immutable and never changes. And St. Basil provides a rather poetic reflection, saying, "As sometimes on a bright night, while gazing with watchful eyes on the inexpressible beauty of the stars, you have thought of the Creator of all things. If you have asked yourself who it is that has dotted heaven with such flowers, and why visible things are even more useful than beautiful. If sometimes in the day you have studied the marvels of light, if you have raised yourself by visible things to the invisible being, then you are a well-prepared listener, and you can come take your place in this august and blessed amphitheater. Come in the same way that anyone not knowing a town is taken by the hand and led through it. Thus I am going to lead you like strangers through the mysterious marvels of the great city of the universe." And now you can see why he was such a great orator. To just say that kind of stuff off the fly is pretty good. He was quite famous for that kind of thing. And this is certainly what Basil strives to do, is to lead his listeners through the great mysterious marvels of the universe. As I think I mentioned in the prior class, a lot of his homilies are like a National Geographic episode, where you're led through the different things that are different animals, and look at these neat things that are going on, and what the scientists of their day, Aristotle and a few others, say about this and that thing. So he's trying to really fill people with awe about how magnificent God is in his creation. So that's a lot of the focus of these homilies. And I would certainly invite you all to do the same, to get outside frequently, even for a little bit in the day and at the nighttime. Look up at the sky, watch for a shooting star. This time of year you can see the fireflies. They're quite beautiful. I was happy to see that this has the same sort of fireflies we had back in Asheville, North Carolina when I lived there. If you've noticed, they start up in the treetops and their lights are blue, and then eventually you see fireflies that are down lower and their lights are kind of a greenish yellow. So I think we have two different types of fireflies. It's It's hard to know, though, because apparently scientists don't know much about the fireflies. It's one thing that's not been studied very much. So if you go to try to find a lot of detailed information on this, you're not going to find much of anything. So you just kind of have to go outside and observe what is one of the few mysteries we still have in the bug life around us. But yeah, get out and appreciate everything. St. Basil continues and says, I'm going to lead you like strangers to the mysterious marvels of this great city of the universe. You will know that you are formed of earth, but the work of God's hands, much weaker than the brute beast, but ordained to command beings without reason and soul. Inferior as regards natural advantages, but thanks to the privilege of reason, capable of raising yourself to heaven. If we are penetrated by these truths, we shall know ourselves, we shall know God, we shall adore our Creator. Everything is fighting for our attention these days, especially the various electronic devices that we have. And St. Basil is calling us to make a sacrifice. Anytime we pay attention to something, we are sacrificing attention to everything else other than that one thing. And in doing so, we are offering a form of veneration to what holds us captive. So, what are we going to sacrifice to? What will we venerate with our time and our attention? We can worship God through the veneration, the attention that we give him, by being awestruck at his creation and proclaiming his praises, so being doxological, and offering thanksgiving, being Eucharistic. Or we can sacrifice and venerate worldly distractions, but I don't recommend doing that much. Any questions on day 4 and the creation of the luminaries? Going once, going twice. All right. Let's move on to day 5 then. God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and the fowl that may fly above the earth, and the open firmament above heaven. So the birds. And God created great whales, which in the original language would be more like dragons and sea monsters. I much prefer that translation. And every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after its kind, and God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. So on the 4th day, God adorned the earth with plants, the dry land with plants. On the 5th day, he adorns the heavens above and the seas below. So kind of that separation of the firmaments are now adorned. The way high firmament, the area above the firmament, would be where the sun and the moon and the stars are and all that. That was their adornment. But the area below the firmament, still in the sky though, would be where the birds are adorning. And then down below, in the waters below, are the fish and everything that he makes. Again, Basil leads you on a long National Geographic type of tale through the what they knew about sea life and everything at that time. He pulls many moral lessons out of this as well. He talks about like how you can observe sailors, especially who are out in the waters a lot. You'll see like one fish eating another fish, and then as it's doing that, another bigger fish comes and eats that fish. And he compares that to people who devour one another, and especially who are greedy, and says that God is the fisherman of all men and will eventually catch everyone. And so you better get your stuff straight, or else God will be after you. So then he talks about, he says a squid, but I think they mean an octopus. He talks about a color-changing squid-type creature who can camouflage itself against whatever it's against. I think there are squids that do that as well, but I know there are octopus who do that extremely well. They can camouflage themselves to pretty much any surface. And he compares that to people who flatter you and act like they're the same as you to try to get your trust and then stab you in the back later, and basically says don't be like the squid. Of course, it's not all negative. There's the ant that Solomon brings up in the book of Proverbs. And then, of course, there's the common little clam and the pearls that form inside of it. And he mentions that these pearls, of course, adorned kings' crowns, adorned the gospel book, if you've ever seen ancient gospel books. And a lot of beautiful things, a lot of icons have been adorned with pearls and other precious stones. But how was the pearl created? Anybody know?
Rain of sand in a lot of time.
Yeah. It can take up to 2 years, and a grain of sand or some other irritant is covered with a substance called nacre. And that is a beautiful substance, and it gets coated over and over. And in this, we see that through hardships, we can cultivate beauty inside of us if we refrain from the path of bitterness and complaining. Basil is in awe over the creatures who migrate every year, especially the fish and all these things that are following God and the path that he's given each one of them. Today we say, oh, it's just instinct. Of course, by that we mean we have no idea how that's working. But we have a nice word for it, so we can pretend like we know. But of course, we see God's providential hand in all of this. Then it comes to birds. St. Basil, again, follows the same pattern. He mentions flying insects, which I thought was really interesting. Apparently, he lists flying insects with the birds and assumes that they were created on this day. I won't argue with him on that. I don't know. I guess that works. It flies. That's good enough for him. I don't want to go over all the different lessons he had there because it would be a lot. I do want to mention that birds and fish are created on the same day. And it makes sense because birds, in some sense, swim through the air as fish swim through water, or you could say that the fish fly through the water as birds fly through the air. They are the things that glide and fly through their environment. And so they are made on the same day, and it kind of parallels that separation of the waters and everything. And maybe the easiest way be to demonstrate a little bit of this. For those of you who have not noticed this pattern, it's fairly obvious. A lot of people have pointed it out. Actually, I don't have to take my whole notebook. I've got this page separate. So on day 1, you have let there be light. And on day 4, you have the sun, moon, etc. So 1 and 4 correspond with each other. On 2, you have firmament, division of the waters. And day 5, you have the things that swim above and below. And on day 3, you've got the land and water being divided, as well as plants. And on 6, we've got the animals and people who live on the land and eat the water, eat the plants. So you can see that each day is symmetrical with the 3 behind it. So it's an interesting little way that it works out symbolically. But I want to bring this to your attention partially. We'll get into allegory more later, but just to show you that these things are written and done in a way that is highly symbolic and meaningful. And God didn't just pick an arbitrary day to do things, but there's meaning and significance behind it all. God said, returning to the passage, Genesis 1:24-25, let the earth bring forth the living creature after its kind, cattle and creeping thing, beast of the earth after its kind. And so God made the beast of the earth upon and everything that creeps upon the earth, and God saw that it was good. And I forgot to note that I reached the end of day 5. So were there any questions about the fish and birds day? Okay. All right. So yeah, now we're into day 6 and the creation of the beasts. St. Basil sees in this a progression. So you have things that swim and fly that we generally don't interact with very much. And then you have these land animals that we do interact with a whole lot. Probably most of you have some sort of land animal in your home. And anybody here want to share what your land animal what is? Cat, dog? Anybody got a cat or a dog? Okay, yeah.
2 cats.
Yeah. So we have lots of these land animals, but every once in a while you meet people who have fish, but they usually don't have like a really close friendship with their fish. It just doesn't happen that way. Of course, I think Basil would have been impressed by SeaWorld, the things that we have done with animals, but that's a pretty recent thing in human history. For the most part, though, he sees this as a progression leading up to the creation of humanity, the crowning of creation. So let's see here. So we'll briefly get into the creation of man. I don't know that we'll have enough time to end that because I have quite a bit on that. But we'll go ahead and start on that and see where we get. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So suddenly the language changes when it comes to the making of man. It goes from "let the earth bring forth," because if you remember, like God didn't go down and form the animals, the birds, the fish, or anything like that. He says, "Let the earth bring forth, let the sea bring forth," etc. But then when it comes to man, he says, "Let us make man in our image." It's as if he commanded all creation to appear, and it did so in obedience to his word. Yet when it came time to make man, our Lord stoops down to craft us out of clay. And St. Gregory, Pope of Rome, wrote about this passage, "But before man was made, it is said, 'Let us make man,' so that it would truly seem that he was formed as a rational creature, as though made with deliberation. He is formed from the earth as if by study, and he is raised up by the breath of the Creator through the power of the vital spirit, evidently so that he who was made in the image of the Creator would exist not by a word or command, but by the dignity of an action." So who was God talking to when he says, "Let us make man in our image"? Any guesses?
Himself.
Yeah, it was the Father speaking to the Son is what we would teach as Christians there. He was speaking to his Son, which the Scripture says in several places, through him, whom and in whom all things were made. So then the passage continues in Genesis. "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." While all other creatures were created in vast numbers, the church fathers talk about when God creates the fish, for example, there's just suddenly millions of fish. And, hundreds of thousands maybe of each kind just suddenly spawn forth immediately and just appear. And everything's just instantaneous. But then when it comes to man, just one man and one woman are made. And God stoops down and forms us from the clay. And it's a much more intimate process. Also, this creation of just one man and one woman sets the pattern for intimate human love and marriage as between one man and one woman, so that by this the bond of love might bind the human race more tightly to one another. We are created in the image and likeness of God, which is interpreted generally in one way, but St. John Chrysostom surprised me. I don't know if any of you got a chance to read any of his homilies on this. He taught that it was due to man's dominion and authority over creation and acting as a ruler just as God rules over. And so he said that is what it means to be made in the image of God, and didn't go any further and didn't say anything else. And I was kind of surprised that he just left it at that. But that's where he left it. Of course, pretty much all the other church fathers talk about us being made in God's image, meaning we have a reason-endowed soul. We have what might be called a spirit inside of us. We are part animal, part angel. We have this animal nature with a physical body, and yet we also have a spiritual aspect to our humanity. Both these things were combined in us as the crown of creation. And so we have one foot in the physical world and another foot in the angelic world. To be both animal and angel is to be fully human. By bridging this gap between the animal and the angelic, we act as priests, offering the physical creation up to God. And we're going to dive a lot more deeply into those themes soon when we get into chapters 2 and 3. And I would like to make a recommendation for reading St. Gregory of Nyssa, and it's called On the Making of Man. It's in the public domain, so you can get it pretty easily. There's a website called New Advent that's got a lot of the writings of the fathers. You can go there. I think it's newadvent.com /fathers, and you can see St. Gregory of Nyssa's this volume that Father Peter here has next to him. There's 36 of those. 30 something of them, and all of those are on this website, including St. Basil's Hexameron. That comes from there. It's in the public domain because it was translated back in the 1800s. So this website has a lot of it. The author of the website did go through and actually update the language just a little bit to make it slightly more modern English. He didn't touch it up very much, but just a tiny bit. So it's actually a little bit easier to read on there than if you were to get that book and read through that. So I highly recommend that site and checking out the church fathers that are on there. So On the Making of Man is the name of the work that I would like you all to read. It's in 30 chapters, and some of the chapters are super short and some of them are pretty long, but each one addresses a particular theme, and it's excellent. I'm almost through it myself, and this talk I have based on St. Basil's Hexameron, and then read all the other church fathers that I could get to and kind of inserted them into my outline that I made from St. Basil. Which is basically what all the other church fathers did. I didn't think about that until now, but all the other church fathers basically took St. Basil's Hexameron and then just added to it and used it as their outline. So this would be within the tradition, come to think of it. So anyway, I'll be doing that with St. Gregory of Nyssa's On the Making of Man with my next set when I get into chapters 2 and 3. It'll be another class or two before we get there. Because I do want to go into the allegorical stuff before we move on. So the passage continues in Genesis. God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So Bede says, Scripture necessarily took care to repeat this about the creation of man, saying, And God blessed them, and said, Increase and multiply, and fill the earth, lest anyone should think that sin was present in the honorable marriage, and that the marriage bed was coupled with filth and fornication. Which is a good point to make, because there have certainly been Christians that have taught just that, and taught against marriage and all that. God sanctified marriage and marital relations between the man and the woman, revealing this act of intimacy and procreation as a blessed thing. And Bede continues and says, But if the human race grows and multiplies with the blessing of God, how much do they deserve to be cursed who forbid marriage and condemn the arrangement of the heavenly decree as if it had been invented by the devil? Therefore marriage, which the grace of the divine blessing instituted for the propagation of the human race and the filling of the earth, must not be condemned. But more to be honored and worthy of a greater blessing is virginity. And so, of course, that echoes what St. Paul wrote, that it's not like one thing is good and one thing is bad. It's that marriage is good, but virginity for the Lord's sake is better. So that's what he's saying here. St. Ephrem points out that multiplying and filling the earth, not just paradise. He doesn't say go and multiply and fill up paradise or Eden. He says go and fill up the earth. That's part of our divine command. He says God foresaw our fall and blessed us to fill the earth and rule over it. Paradise was already a blessed state and place anyway, so there would be no reason to bless life in the blessed state of paradise. But God knew we would be leaving there sooner than later, and we would need a blessing while abiding outside of it. So after the fall, the blessing is realized. And Venerable Bede affirms this and states, God gave us these blessings in advance, knowing we would fall and our fragile human nature would need the help of sea creatures as food and land animals to assist us. There's a little poem that many of the fathers, St. Basil kind of sort of alludes to it with us not being like the quadrupeds who, are always looking down, or the carnivores who are looking, straight across or even down, but that we are made upright. We are made upright so that we can look up to the heavens. And several of the fathers reference this, and it's actually a reference, and some of them just quote it right out, to Metamorphosis by Ovid, which says, and while all the animals face down look at the earth, he gave to man an uplifted face and ordered him to view the heavens and raise his upright countenance to the stars. Basil exclaims, your head, O man, is turned toward heaven, your eyes look up. Therefore, when you become a slave to your belly or other base passions, you degrade yourself to being like the animals around you. Raise your soul above the earth to more noble cares. You are called to these things. Your true country is the heavenly Jerusalem. In a later class, we'll talk about the souls of plants and animals and people, compare and contrast. The fathers do use the word soul for what a plant possesses, so we'll get into what that means when we get into chapters 2 and 3. And if you read St. Gregory's work that I just recommended, you'll get a sneak peek into that. So I have a brief note here on the devil, which I think we'll end it with that. Alfric in the Anglo-Saxon Hexameron explains one of the Christian traditions, which is that on this day, the sixth day of creation, the devil fell. And he says, at this time, the devil fell from the heights of heaven together with his associates on account of his pride and the punishment of hell. And when the devil wished to lift himself above God, he fell quickly down together with all the angels that were in his council, and they were transformed into accursed devils. Then God wished to make man out of the earth, who with humility should deserve the same place in the fellowship of the angels that the devil forfeited through his presumption. So the idea is that on the sixth day, the devil falls, then God makes man to take the place of the devil and all of his angels that fell. And so that number will be replaced with the multitude of believers who come to believe in the heavenly realms. So that's a pretty ancient teaching. It's one of a few different ideas and traditions on when the devil and his angels fell, but thought I would go ahead and throw that out there. Any questions on any of this so far? I think it's important to note that of course, the devil and the demons are simply fallen angels because God creates no evil. It's simply a perversion of what was good, and that's what becomes demonic and diabolical. Okay, well, we will pick up there at the next class. It's been about an hour. In fact, according to this, 1 hour on the dot. So it's a lot of material to cover, and I don't want to hit you all with too much at once. So in the next class, we will look at actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and finish up this one section, and that will get us into the next section. I didn't realize I only had a page left. God said, behold, I have given you green herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be food. So the plants were given to man as food. And if you read the Genesis account carefully, you will notice that man did not eat animals until when? After the flood. God gave his blessing for man to begin eating animals at that point. But before the flood, mankind did not eat animals. So that's a very interesting thing. And that was because in the unfallen world, we were the caretakers of the animals. And it didn't, just like you wouldn't eat your pets. Like, who in the world would be like, I'm a little hungry. Hey, Fluffy. That would just be weird. Anyway, at that time, before the fall, all the animals and humans were at peace with one another. So it would make no sense for us to eat the animals that were basically our pets. And then to every beast of the earth and fowl of the air, etc., God gives the green herb as food as well. So here we also see that the animals did not eat each other. There were no carnivores before the fall. So things eating other creatures is a result of the fall and not part of God's original design. And there's one article I read in a magazine on creation that mentioned the mosquitoes. And they said, we think of mosquitoes like, okay, what good were these before the fall? Like these little blood-sucking vampires. But it said that they used to be more like hummingbirds than vampires. Some mosquitoes still to this day drink nectar from flowers, and they are the main pollinators in some regions. And if I remember, Alaska is one of those regions where there aren't too many honeybees, and mosquitoes are actually the pollinators there. So they basically used to be like little bees instead of little vampires, which is interesting. So it shows us, though, that everything was created with a good cause.
Who wrote that, Father? Who said that? Or-
That was from a magazine that I read. I think it was called Acts and Facts.
That's who-
Yeah.
I've wondered the same thing.
Yeah. So the idea is, if we were intelligent enough to figure it out, we would be able to see that with every single creature on this planet, every single bug, everything, it would all make sense. Like, this thing used to be very benign, and now because of our fall, it's become what it is. So as our research advances, we find more ways that creatures are beneficial to us and even the entire planet that we never imagined. I looked up the example of whales as just one thing. They play an important role in balancing the marine ecosystem and even help outside the ocean. As gross as it is, their fecal plumes, as they call them, provide necessary nutrients for phytoplankton to thrive, which in turn feeds a lot of the marine life and reduces carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the air. So I thought that was interesting. Then, there's many of other things that are beneficial to us that we just don't even know about. And St. John Chrysostom calls this the mark of love that God gives us on his creation. He says there's a twofold benefit. They lead those of us willing to think aright to the knowledge of God, and they cause us to be amazed at the greatness of his loving kindness. He continues, may we see the overflowing abundance of his creatures and be overwhelmed at the Creator's power produced by a certain wisdom. So we will get more into the fall and its complications and implications in the next class, or the one after that. So God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and morning were the sixth day. So at the very end, he calls this very kalos, very good, very beautiful. And I want to just talk about that very briefly, and then we are done. So this is him seeing everything properly ordered. Remember, I was saying something that is good, that is kalos, that is beautiful, is properly ordered and exactly as it's meant to be. That was God's first judgment of the earth, calling it very good. Seeing us and everything else and saying this is very good. That was the judgment, the first one. There will come another judgment later. That is the final judgment. And in that, God will look at us and see if we are kalos. See if we have been healed to be conformed back to his image and likeness as he made us. To see if through us we are redeeming creation itself and bringing that back to God and offering that back up to God. Have we been responsible stewards of this earth and of the things he has given us? Are we very good? Or will he look at us and say, like he did to the 5 unwise virgins, depart from me, I do not know you. In other words, I look at you and you're not the thing that I made on the 6th day. What is this? This is not, the image and likeness is not there. It's gone. What happened to this? This is not the creature I made. This is not kalos. This is not good. This is not beautiful. And so that is the final judgment. And the final judgment, in some sense, is going back to the first judgment. Is it very good? Are we very good? Are we bringing things back the way they should be? Starting right here in our hearts. So I leave you with that thoughts. We will get more into further discussions when we come back. Any questions on any of that?